Hello and welcome to episode 47 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2, where today we shall be taking a look at some more advanced stuff to do with airflow, and in specific looking at tuning ride height and rake to get better aerodynamic performance and efficiency and maximising the performance of your car. Now, most people just tune the ride height to try and get it as low as they possibly can without actually bottoming out on the surface of the track, and in that obviously they are lowering their centre of gravity, which is increasing their mechanical grip, and it's also actually going to reduce drag, so you're therefore going to be able to hit a higher top speed. However, there is a lot that you can do in terms of adjusting the ride height to get much better aero efficiency and get more downforce. It's actually a lot more powerful than actually tuning the wing angles or splitter angles that are available for tuning on the tyres, brakes and chassis tab. So what is it exactly that you should be aiming for? And this is going to vary a lot depending on the actual track that you're going to be racing on, and whether it's a high downforce, a medium downforce or a low downforce circuit. And then of course the cars themselves, as they're each going to produce various different amounts of downforce, they're going to have their own preferred ride heights and rake angles, so you'll need to bear that in mind and kind of come at it a bit more of an open approach rather than trying to use exactly the same settings from say one GT3 car in comparison to another. So it is going to be a case of trial and error, but in this episode I will be covering various different methods that you can apply to pretty much all cars, and it's obviously then going to depend on the type of setup that you actually want for the track that you're actually racing on. So we'll start off with the easiest method of tuning, which is going for a low downforce, high top speed setup. And in this case what you essentially want to do is get the car as low as you possibly can, but also get the car as flat as you possibly can when reaching near the top speeds that you will be achieving around the track. So say for instance you're in an LMP1 car and you're racing around Le Mans, you want to be looking to get the car as flat as you possibly can, roughly around about the 280 kilometers to 300 kilometers an hour mark, which is going to be around 175 miles an hour, pushing on towards 185 to 190 odd miles an hour. Now, in getting the car nice and low and getting it as flat as you possibly can, what you're doing is reducing the amount of drag that the car is going to produce, and the car is therefore going to be able to cut through the air a lot cleaner and therefore be able to reach a higher top speed much easier. However, it's not quite as simple as just putting the ride height settings to as low as they can possibly go on both the front and the rear. That is just going to be your static ride height, and that is going to change when you actually go and pick up speed. The airflow going over the car will press down on the top of the car and push it down towards the tarmac, which could potentially lead to bottoming out, which is going to prevent you from getting towards your top speed. And therefore, in some cases, it could be beneficial to keep just above the minimum ride height. For example, I did a race around Daytona in the Toyota TSO 50 LMP1 car, and keeping about 4 to 5 millimeters off the lowest ride height settings that I could possibly go, I was actually able to reach a higher top speed than if I was actually to run the minimum ride height that the car would allow in the tuning setup. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we're obviously going to have the high downforce setup, where increasing the ride height will allow more airflow under the car and through the diffuser, which is going to increase your downforce, especially at the rear. But that is only going to happen up to a certain point. If you go too high with the ride height, then the airflow will spill out from underneath the floor and the diffuser will therefore not work as efficiently. Obviously, you're raising the wings higher up into the air as you increase the ride height, so they're going to produce more downforce from there. But again, that's also going to increase the amount of drag that you're producing as the car's profile is much higher up in the air as well. So you will want to be finding a balance here where you're maximizing the amount of airflow going along the floor of the car and coming out through the diffuser, but obviously it's not too high that that airflow is actually spilling out and your aero efficiency is going to pop because you're producing way more drag than you actually are downforce. Of course, rake angle is also going to have an impact here, and rake angle is essentially the angle difference between the underside or the floor of your car in comparison to the track surface. So a shallow rake would have a small angle difference between the floor and the track surface, so the two are kind of running in parallel, whereas a high or aggressive rake will have a much greater angle of attack, whether that is positive rake with the rear end of the car up much higher than the front end, or a negative rake angle where the front of the car is much higher up than the rear end of the car. Now, the actual rake angle that you'll be wanting to run for your car is going to very much depend on the car. Different cars prefer different rake angles, and it's very much a kind of trial and error in order to find what the perfect suitable rake angle actually is. Some cars are going to prefer a much more aggressive rake angle, whereas others will probably prefer a much flatter car and a much shallower angle. It all depends on the car, and then it also depends on the track as well, as to obviously how much downforce you're actually wanting, and then obviously balancing that with the aero efficiency and trying to get the car nice and flat for those straights in order to try and maximize your top speed around the circuit. So it is very much a delicate balancing act, and when you're tuning your ride height options and trying to find the ideal rake, what you'll want to be doing is doing it in very small increments, as just making tiny little small changes just by a couple of millimeters to the ride height, for instance, on some cars could have very big impact. So make sure that you do each change with small increments, going out and testing, and basically progressively and slowly refining the ride height and the rake angles and trying to find the optimum settings for those for the car that you are driving. Now, at this point you're probably wondering what kind of aspects in the tuning setup you can adjust in order to tune your ride height and the rake angles. And the first and most obvious thing is actually adjusting the ride height here over on the suspension tab. Now, one thing to note with these ride height settings is these are your static ride height settings. So once you actually get moving and the car is in motion and your speed increases, the further you are going to deviate from these ride height settings that you have here. So as you can see, I've got a ride height of 50mm on the front, 56mm on the rear. Once I actually get up to speed and up near the top speed of the car is going to be much closer towards the surface of the track, and my ride height is probably going to be more around 20 odd millimeters. So you need to keep in mind that as your speed increases, your ride height is going to change as well, and there's a number of factors that influence how much your ride height is going to change from the static ride height that you set here. Now, obviously, having the rear ride height up higher than the front ride height, I've got a little bit of rake angle here, or should I say static rake angle here, which is going to allow me to produce a little bit more downforce on the rear than at the front of the car. But also what I've actually done is, with this entire tuning setup, is actually found the perfect balance where I'm producing enough downforce through the corners, but I'm also getting the car nice and flat to maximize the top speed on the straights here at Le Mans. This is a setup that I built for the Le Mans circuit with the Toyota TSO 50 LMP1 car. Now, one of the things that is going to impact your ride height once the vehicle is in motion is your front and rear downforce settings here on the tyres, brakes and chassis tab. The lower the values that you have here, the less angle you're going to put in the splitter into the wings, the aerodynamic elements, and therefore the less downforce that you're going to produce. Whereas if you go and increase these values, you are going to produce more downforce and more drag from those elements, but it's also going to have a much greater downward push on the car, and it's going to push the car closer down towards the tarmac. So running with higher values is going to have a greater change in your ride height once the car gets moving in comparison to running lower downforce values. Now, what you should predominantly be doing after this episode is trying to get as much downforce as possible from the ride height for the type of track that you want and the amount of downforce that you need, and then using the downforce options here as kind of a little bit more tweaking and kind of perfecting. At times you will want to be having quite high values here, as well as running a good amount of ride height in order to maximize the airflow along the underside of the car, and therefore you're getting a good, or you're basically trying to maximize the amount of downforce. Obviously, other times you want to have these values as low as possible to increase the top speed, and then likewise be trying to get the car nice and flat at high speed and getting the car as low as possible without bottoming out. Now, there are a number of options that you can use in order to control how much the ride height is going to change at speed. One of these is going to be your spring rates, and then if your car actually has a third spring, such as this LMP1 car that we're in here, if they have a third spring, you can also control it here as well. And essentially, having stiffer springs is going to allow less movement or less change in ride height in comparison to soft springs. So if you have really nice soft springs, yes, you may increase the amount of mechanical grip that you're producing, but you allow the ride height to change a lot more, and you're therefore decreasing the aerodynamic performance. The more stable and more static that the aerodynamic elements actually are, the greater their efficiency, the more downforce you're going to produce from them. So high downforce cars will benefit from having higher or stiffer springs, and therefore with that, you're also going to get less deviation in ride height as your speed increases as well. Now, another thing that you can use is also the bump stops as well. Running smaller or lower bump stops is going to allow for greater movement, whereas increasing them is going to allow for less movement. And once again, if your car has a third spring, you also have a third damper bump stop option here as well, where you'll also be able to control how much the ride height is going to change. So with all those kind of things in mind, you'll be able to essentially tune the ride height, try and find that nice balance between producing either the highest top speed that you possibly can and getting the car nice and flat, or be trying to produce as much downforce as you possibly can through the corners, but again also trying to get the car nice and level for those straights, so you're increasing your aerodynamic efficiency, and you're therefore not producing as much drag as your speed increases. Now, when it comes to actually testing and adjusting and tuning these options, this is where things are going to become a little bit more difficult, because you're quite limited in the amount of data that's available to you. Over on the telemetry HUD, there is the availability to be able to watch and see your ride heights, but obviously as you're traveling at speed and the car is going over bumps, you'll see these ride heights change and fluctuate an awful lot, so it could be pretty difficult to actually get an accurate reading and actually making sure that you are getting the car nice and flat when you want the car nice and flat at those higher speeds. Obviously, you want to be trying to do all your testing and tuning setup work at the actual track that you are producing your setup for. However, what you may need to do is go to another track which is a bit smoother, doesn't have as many bumps on the straights, and try to get to reach the similar sort of speeds and test and tune that way. One place that could work quite well is the Mojave drag strip on the Mojave test track, as there's a lot of room there for you to reach similar sort of speeds to the track that you'll be actually driving at, and obviously it being a drag strip, there's no hills or bumps to go over, so the surface should be a lot flatter, and it should allow you to get a much more accurate reading of your ride heights when traveling at the speed similar to those that you'll be achieving on the track that you're producing the tune for. Now, when it comes to actually trying to tune for the amount of downforce that you're actually producing, this is where you'll need to look outside of the game, because there isn't any information within it on the telemetry screen. There is a number of apps out there that do produce various different pieces of telemetry that you can use, which could potentially help you here. One of them being PC Tuner. It does cost £10 in order to subscribe to, but it is a one-time payment, and it gives you a number of, or shall I say, allows you to view various different pieces of telemetry that is taken from the car and taken from the game and put into some nice graphs that you can read. One of them being the amount of downforce that the car is roughly producing, and then the other is the actual ride height of the car as well. Now, these actually match up to what you'll see on the telemetry HUD view with the ride height output there. However, obviously it gets presented in a nice graph that you can drag the mouse and the cursor and the little indicator along to get a much more accurate and raw value, and is therefore much easier to adjust and tune the ride height, the front and rear downforce settings, the suspension, the bump stops, the third spring, and everything there that will obviously impact the amount of downforce and the ride heights of the car. So Whilst it's not 100% ideal, there is that option and that facility to use if you so wish to use it. The other only option is to just do it by feel, seeing how much speed you can carry through corners just by turning laps, and then obviously adjusting the ride height and your rake angle through there and seeing what works for the car, whether the car feels a lot more oversteery or whether it feels a lot more stable with a more neutral balance, or whether it's leaning more towards understeer. But that's pretty much going to conclude it for this episode. In next week's episode, we'll be taking a look at some more airflow stuff, as we'll be covering IndyCar, NASCAR and overalls in general. So we'll be doing the rules and regulations there. But more importantly, we'll be covering the airflow of racing in tight proximity and within packs, and how to exploit the airflow on those oval and bank circuits in IndyCar and NASCAR races. So make sure to tune in for that episode for some more advanced airflow stuff. But that's going to conclude it for this episode. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed and learnt something new from this video, please give it a thumbs up and feel free to share it to friends and other fellow racers. I'll leave in the description a couple of links, one to a useful Aerodynamics thread that the guy who produced the Project Cars Tuner app actually made, and I'll also post a link to the actual thread where you can actually find the Project Cars Tuner app as well if you wish to purchase and utilize that. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching the episode, guys. Make sure to tune in for next week's episode and to subscribe for the channel for more content in the future. Other than that, thanks very much. Have a good one, have fun, and take care.